Hey, everybody. So, we've been talking about life and what is life, and we mentioned that one of the key characteristics of life is that it evolves over time. It has evolutionary adaptation. And the last time we talked about how natural selection means that as this evolution occurs, species that have traits that let them take better advantage of their environment are more likely to survive to have babies. Well, somehow those traits need to be encoded so that they can be passed down. On Earth, on all Earth life forms, that's done through DNA. Now, we think that aliens probably won't have exactly the same DNA that we have, but it will at least have a similar kind of analogous sort of system. They've got to have some way of encoding their traits and passing it down. So today we're going to look at what is DNA at kind of a detailed level and figure out how it works and how it encodes those traits. Let's get started. All right, so DNA is what's allowing evolutionary adaptation to take place. And again, I want to stress this is not the only way that it can be done, but certainly it seems to work here on Earth because all life on Earth evolved from a common ancestor, and that common ancestor, that earliest form of life, used DNA. So evolution needs some way to encode these traits. Otherwise, well, it just stays random, or people just appear in different ways, and we're not able to evolve over time. So complex life would never develop in that case because you might just somehow randomly one in a quadrillion chance of here's a human. But if it can't reproduce in such a way that it passes those traits on, you get a single human and that's it. So complex life will just never develop. So all Earth life encodes their traits using DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Interestingly, DNA is, even though as complex as it is, it's based on a surprisingly simple alphabet. It's based on just four of these organic molecules, these amino acids that form the proteins that make up DNA. So we will use their initial letter here to abbreviate them. So A, T, G, and C. But the key thing is that A and T can only mate together, and G and C can only mate together. While I've idealized it, they don't actually look like this. But they've got bonds that can only join with each other. So A won't, under normal circumstances, join with C, and G won't normally bond with T. This is what enables the DNA to replicate itself so precisely. So this is an actual strand of DNA. And this is one of the first electron microscope pictures that we've ever had of DNA. You can see the spiral structure going in there. And you see how the A and the T's will bond and the C's and the G's will bond to their components over there. So when DNA replicates, there's some enzymes that will come in and they will unzip the DNA molecule, basically like this. So those enzymes come in, it splits the molecule. Now, from other chemicals that are in the environment, then they'll be floating around in the environment, being the cell environment. Then the A's will meet up with the T's, the G's will meet up with the C's, and so on and so on. And so till we have two exact copies, and they always will be exact, almost always will be exact, because of the way these bonds work. You can't, they will magically just float around and attract, and then that will replicate the DNA, and now we've got two strands. And so this is happening trillions and trillions and trillions of times in your body over your lifetime. And the number of errors that it makes is very, very, very small. So, yes, errors can occur. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but they are very rare. If they were not rare, then basically your body would fall apart because it couldn't replicate itself every time you tried to grow a new cell. So DNA's magic then comes in with these bonds and with these letters being able to G only go with C and A only go with T. So what I want you to do is take a look at this, and I want you to pause the video, and I want you to figure out which base pairs will complete the sequence. So based on what you know about how T bonds with whichever, and A and G and C, work out the match and figure out what the other half of this DNA strand should look like. Pause the video. Do that now. Okay. So this should be what you've got, right? So you should get A, T, C, T, G, T, A, because those are the only ones that can pair with it. So if those individual amino acids were floating around in the cell, they would snap into the correct place. So the enzymes unzip it, it takes in the extras from there, both sides do, and so then you've got two identical pieces of DNA from them. Now, the words are formed from three DNA base pairs in a row. And as I said, some of them mean stop, some of them mean start. So basically, you'll have a sequence of DNA, and you'll have a word that says, okay, this is the start of the encoding of that trait. And then it will go on, and then there'll be a word that says, okay, this is the stop for the encoding of that trait. And interestingly, there's only 64 of these words total, and that makes up all of the traits that you see. Now, personally, one of the things I would like to know is, okay, we understand that this particular trait, if I've got this word and this word and this word and this word and this word, that may cause you to have blue eyes. How? How exactly do the proteins influence your eye color? That's where we're just on the verge. Right now, we're just identifying what these different words seem to mean, and we can do that by saying, okay, well, I know this organism has blue eyes, and I know all the blue-eyed organisms have this particular structure, this particular trait there. So eventually, we may be able to figure out the actual mechanism, and we're getting closer, but we're not quite there yet. So these are actual genes. These are humans. And so each of these genes, then these words, then join onto long collections called chromosomes. And these chromosomes then are what are going to get passed. But each chromosome has the full set for that particular trait. And as you probably know, one set comes from one parent and one set comes from the other parent. These over here are specialized because here we've got XX. We could this organism then is therefore female. If we have an XY, then that's going to be male. So humans have 22 pairs of chromosomes. They're matched, and then we have two sex chromosomes that are going to determine your gender from them. But this is not the only way. Ants have the smallest number of chromosomes. Female ants have 2. Male ants only have 1 from that, and those 1 chromosome and 2 with the female are all that we need to encode all of the physical structure, all of the behaviors, everything that makes up an ant. So if you think about it, if only 1 chromosome can make up an ant and give all the complexity that we see, in ant colonies and things like that, imagine what you can do with 22 of them plus 2 sex chromosomes. Ferns are actually one of the most complicated genetic structures out there. And so we may think humans are the top of evolution, and so we must have the most DNA matched pairs. No, we are nothing compared to a lot of different types of plants. Ferns have over 1,200 chromosomes from that. And so what all of those chromosomes do, we don't know necessarily. But certainly they are genetically much more complex than human beings. Now, I mentioned that the DNA transcription process is, for the most part, almost 100% accurate, but that almost is what leads to the variations that we see here. So let's suppose that I've got this gene composed of 3-letter words, and no, these aren't the actual letters that DNA is made out of, but it gives us an idea. So we've got 3 genetic words, 3-letter genetic words. So the fat cat ate the rat. Right? So suppose this sentence is a gene, and it encodes some trait. Let's assume that this particular sequence causes the life form to have brown eyes. All right. Obviously, it doesn't. Again, I'm just making up some letters here so that we get a sentence that actually makes sense in English to us. All right. Now, random errors can occur. First of all, the transcription process is very, very close to 100%. But because we're doing trillions of these, every once in a while, you'll get a random error. So you might have base pairs that are randomly added or deleted into this gene. So, for example, what if we added an A after the 3rd letter in the gene sequence? So what if we added an A here? How would that rewrite the gene sequence? Well, it's going to look something like that, right? So if we took the A and we put it here, we're still going to get 3-letter words. But now I have the afatakata that eth arati. Okay, so the sentence now doesn't make any sense. And so the cell looks at this and says, I have no idea what it is you're wanting me to do. So the cell just dies. So anytime it gets instructions that it can't understand, the cell dies. This is happening all the time. Out of trillions of duplications, you're going to get a couple of errors in there, and that particular cell just dies. But you have trillions of cells in your body. That's not really going to be a big problem. All right, going back to our original, the fat cat ate the rat. However, sometimes you get a mutation that is viable. And so a mutation is any change in the genetic structure here. But if it's viable, then that means that trait can be passed down to its offspring. The offspring will actually survive. So what if we replace the R with a B? So some genetic transcription came in, maybe it got exposed to a virus, maybe it was something happened with a cosmic ray or something like that. And then, so if we replace that, then we get the fat cat ate the bat. Well, the sentence makes sense. So the cell says, well, Roger that, sir. And it goes on and it executes these instructions. So if the cell can survive, well, then the organism as a whole can survive as well. So maybe this is the gene that gives you blue eyes. Instead of the fat cat ate the rat, it's the fat cat ate the bat that gives you blue eyes. Now, this trait can be passed down. If there was some evolutionary advantage, some sort of natural selection advantage to having the blue eyes, then in that particular environment, most people would have blue eyes. On the other hand, if there's no particular advantage to it, then we're not necessarily going to recruit more. The population of blue-eyed people isn't going to grow. On the other hand, what happened in a lot of cases is we had this family group that had this random mutation, and they happened to move away from those who had the brown eyes, the brown-eyed group. And so because they were only interbreeding with people who had the blue-eye trait, pretty much all of their offspring had blue eyes. But there's nothing inherently advantageous to it. As soon as we get a brown-eyed person to move in there, well, now you can start getting a mix in the population again. All right, going back to our original sentence, the fat cat ate the rat. We can also have a lateral gene transfer. That's when we're swapping letters. So one gene sequence gets replaced by another. So this could, again, viruses are a common way to do this. They'll latch onto the DNA and they'll transfer their own gene sequences into the original gene sequence. So if we replace cat with dog, rat with cat, and fat with big, then instead of the fat cat ate the rat, we get the big dog ate the cat. So this is one way that viruses can actually jump between species. So you can have a virus that originated in bats, like COVID, for example, and then whenever it was exposed, if we got this transcription error, we got these lateral transfers, now we've got a form that can actually survive in humans. It's not the same virus that was in the bat, but it originated with that. And now, because of this random mutation, it's now a human virus that can be transferred amongst humans. There's some other problems that can come in reproduction that don't necessarily have to do with gene transfers. But remember that we have to have matched pairs for everything. Sometimes one or both of one of the parents will transfer two of their chromosomes rather than just one. Normally the egg and the sperm each have one of each of those. Those come together and you get a full set. If the egg, for example, happens to have both pairs from the mother, or the sperm has both pairs from the father, then when they meet up, you get 3 copies of that, and that's called a trisomy. Now, this extra chromosome, there's nothing that can be done. It is not preventable. It is just these random things that happen in the egg and the sperm. One of the probably the most famous trisomy is called Down syndrome, and that's when you get a trisomy of the 21st pair here. So you've got 3 of these. So the genetic structure of somebody with Down syndrome is actually different than somebody without Down syndrome. They actually have an extra chromosome from that. So this is the only reason why this is one of the most well-known is it's one of the few that are actually survivable. In most cases, this extra chromosome causes problems with the cell structure. And so when the baby, if it's got a duplicate, in 9 or 11 or something like that, when the developing fetus gets to the point where it needs that chromosome's instructions, like maybe when the heart develops or the lungs develop or something like that, it gets confused with that. The instructions don't make sense. And so then the fetus is going to die. So very few of these trisomies are actually survivable. One of the few that actually can lead to a full-term birth is trisomy 13 and trisomy 18. Even then, though, the baby usually has enough problems that it's rare for them to survive more than just a few weeks after that. So when we're talking about natural selection, this is the mechanism that's driving evolution. When we get these mutations, these mutations are not necessarily bad because this is where our pool of new traits come from. And the thing you've got to remember is that it is random. So you're just getting a large pool of different traits, some of which are going to let the organism better compete. It's going to make better use of its environment, and so it's going to be more likely to have babies. Some of them aren't going to help it. Some of them are going to be actively harmful from that. But there's nothing driving it towards one particular situation. And as we saw last time, what's good in one situation might actually be a negative trait in another. So over long periods of time, and here I'm talking billions of years, we'll have lots of these random variations. Some are going to help, some are going to reduce the chance, and some just make no difference, blue eyes versus brown eyes. And so they just give us diversity. And then, as I mentioned, all life on Earth is based on DNA because all life on Earth came from a common ancestor. There was a single original life form that used DNA for encoding its traits. Since that got passed on, just mutations from that got passed on. And that's what allowed us the diversity of life that we see today, yet all of it, including microbes, are based on DNA. So when we're thinking about aliens, then we would assume that intelligent aliens evolved from simpler forms on their planet. So those simple forms would have started first, and then they would have grown into, evolved into different aliens, some of which then would hopefully become intelligent. So if that's the case, then we've got evolution taking place on these alien worlds as well. And so again, it's going to need some way to encode its traits. So while it may not be deoxyribonucleic acid that it's using to encode it, it will probably be something similar. There will be some other way that it can make sure that it can make good copies of everything, splits apart, creates some form of duplication, and then is able to grow and develop over time. If not, well, then the life form's just not going to be viable. So again, it might not be DNA, but it will be a DNA analog. It'll be something that functions like DNA. All right, so short lesson here, but I just wanted you to have some idea of how DNA works and why we think there must be some sort of DNA-like thing in aliens, because this is what's going to enable us to make sure that natural selection is working, and then also that will allow us to figure out what these aliens look like based on their environment. Okay, so now you know how we're encoding traits and how we think aliens are going to encode their traits as well. Next week, we're going to start using this to figure out what the aliens are going to look like. We'll first talk about how they eat, how they breathe, how they generate energy, because all of these cells need energy in order to perform their functions and also to reproduce. Remember that it takes energy for those enzymes to split that DNA and then create two copies from that. So we'll look at how they generate energy, and then finally, we'll look at how we can figure out what these aliens actually look like. We'll see you then.